Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last Bookseller, A Life in the Rare Book Trade by Gary Goodman. Narrated by Tristan Morris. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you may hear references to visual elements present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. As long past as 1930, I had a hunch that the talkies would make even the best-selling novelists as archaic as silent pictures. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Crack-Up. Okay, so I know I'm not the last bookseller. People still sell books, but I'm one of the last of a certain kind of bookseller. The kind that for 600 years rooted around basements, book bins, and bookstores, looking for sometimes rare books, or more often, second-hand books. They were the hunter-gatherers of the book business, the travelers and pickers who spent their lives saving books that might otherwise have been lost. They are now nearly extinct, driven to ground by the machines, the cell phones, personal computers, and especially the Internet, that replaced them at the end of the 20th century. Second-hand, used, rare, and less often the fancier antiquarian are used interchangeably here. They all refer to previously owned books and so are in essence the same thing. Some books just cost more than others. The Last Bookseller describes my career as a used and rare book dealer before and during this seismic shift. It is, on one level, a conventional memoir, how I started as a bookseller in 1982, the remarkable, larger-than-life and sometimes criminal people I met buying and selling books, the unusual books I found, and the weird places I found them. But on another level, it is a picture of and a tribute to those traveling booksellers who, beginning with the invention of the printing press in 1440, rescued and preserved so many of the rare books and significant manuscripts that survive today. Most booksellers' memoirs are about finding a pamphlet by Edgar Allan Poe at the bottom of a coal chute and selling it for $500,000. Not this one. I stumbled into the book business when I walked into a small used bookstore in East St. Paul, Minnesota, and despite not knowing a thing about books or business, bought the place. Later, with a couple of partners, I opened another store in the small tourist town of Stillwater, Minnesota, which became so successful and caused so many other booksellers to move there that it became known as a book town. Book towns, that's right, towns full of books, were an actual thing during the roaring 90s of the second-hand book trade. Travis McDade writes in Thieves of Book Row, a remarkable number of the memoirs of booksellers are basically anecdote delivery devices, rich with stories of acquisitions and near misses. This is true of most of these types of books simply because that is what people want to read. Richard Booth, the self-proclaimed king of Hay-on-Wye, Wales, and the originator of the official Booktown movement, comes to Stillwater in this story, as does Larry McMurtry, the famous author and second-hand bookseller who created a book town in his hometown of Archer City, Texas. Melvin McCosh, the Minnesota bookseller who sold books from his run-down mansion on Lake Minnetonka, makes an appearance, and so does A.S.W. Rosenbach, the flamboyant rare book dealer who, in the 1930s, bought original manuscripts of books like Ulysses and the Canterbury Tales. Oh, and then there's the book scout who took showers in public restrooms using tubes and garbage bags. The rare book business in the 1980s and 1990s was also marked by an unusual level of thievery, forgery, and treachery. So several criminals turn up here, including Stephen Blumberg, the St. Paul native, who was the most prolific book thief in history. John Jenkins, the Texas bookseller and world-class poker player who killed himself, or was murdered, while standing in the middle of the Colorado River, and Mark Hoffman, the Mormon rare book dealer and forger who blew up 2 people with pipe bombs to cover up his crimes. When the Internet came along, It was for second-hand booksellers, like a lawyer walking up and discovering that all his clients had gotten law degrees. Before 2000, it took years of experience to become a successful second-hand bookseller. After 2000, anyone in their pajamas with a box of books, a cup of coffee, and a cable connection could buy and sell books online. Between 1990 and 2000, there were nearly 400 used and rare bookshops in New York City. Now, there are fewer than 70. There were almost 50 in Minneapolis-St. Paul. Now, fewer than 10. The Internet wiped out many second-hand booksellers and their traditional bookshops almost overnight. So the kind of bookseller I'm talking about here is a vanishing breed, distinct from independent booksellers, who sell new books and whose bookstores are the last line of defense against the Internet juggernaut. Their stores are also under siege, but so far, the Internet hasn't figured out how to replace them. Before the last dog dies, I wanted to describe what it was like to make a living in this curious and unconventional business. I traveled enough throughout the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada, and saw enough to know my experiences reflect the changes that occurred in bookselling at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. These stories are told from my perspective, but are meant to give a realistic picture of this age-old occupation. The booksellers I describe here might not be the last ones, but they are likely the last of their kind. 1. 4,000 bad books. In the middle of my life, I found myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Dante, The Divine Comedy. On a March morning in 1982, I walked into F. Fithian Books, a small second-hand bookstore on Arcade Street in East St. Paul, Minnesota. A few names have been changed to protect the innocent. The name was above the front door in crooked wooden letters, and in the window a handmade sign announced that the store was going out of business. The place wasn't much bigger than a rich person's walk-in closet. I'd never been in a used bookstore before in my life, and was struck by the musty smell and the chaos, confined as it was to such a small space. The walls were lined with cheap particle-board bookcases. There were toppled stacks of books on the floor, and more books, novels from the turn of the last century, self-help books, beat-up paperbacks, spilled from broken boxes. Prominently displayed, face out on plastic stands, were a few newer children's books. Sections in the store were marked by paper scraps thumbtacked to the shelves, the subjects written in thin ballpoint pen. The fiction section was full, with books stacked from floor to ceiling, but other sections had only 5 or 10 books with signs like Italian Renaissance or Eastern Philosophy tacked below them. Beyond the cases, behind a counter made of plywood and 2x4s, sat a small man whose name I learned was Frank. Frank was a stocky man in his grayish 50s who wore a rumpled suit and smelled like he'd had a few Bloody Marys for breakfast. He told me he was closing the store because of, as he called it, his bad ticker. Heart troubles had forced him to retire as a newspaper reporter, and now angina, or heart palpitations, or AFib had foiled him again. I later came to doubt the heart story. I saw Frank a few years later in downtown St. Paul, and he looked as healthy as a horse. It was always my dream to own a nice bookstore, he said, gesturing around. But this was all I could afford. He wanted to sell the business, but couldn't, because people around here don't appreciate books. The store itself was in a small pocket of down-market businesses in a working-class neighborhood at the intersection of Arcade Street and Maryland Avenue. The cars that drove by were usually on their way somewhere else. On Frank's side of Arcade, there was a drugstore, an empty hair salon, and an antique shop. Kitty Corner, on Maryland, was a liquor store with bars on the door and a yellow sign in the window that advertised quart bottles of Ripple wine for 98 cents each. I was 31 years old then, and lived 3 blocks away in a rented duplex on Wheelock Parkway with my wife, Mary Pat, and our 2 children. I earned what could be charitably called a living, working the night shift on a hospital unit that treated violent and mentally ill adolescents. In fact, a few days before my visit to Frank's store, some of the little rascals had planned to take over the unit by killing the male counselor, that would be me, by hitting him over the head with a sock filled with metal belt buckles. An alert nurse discovered the plot and called the police, but the incident reaffirmed my belief that working with people who wanted to kill you was not a viable long-term profession. So the thought of buying a going concern filled with valuable books— I liked books, didn't I? From a man who, but for a heart condition, would not be selling this plum in the middle of East St. Paul, made perfect sense. If you sold the business instead of closing it, how much would it be? I asked Frank, just out of curiosity. Frank's eyes lit up at the prospect. Let's see, he said, climbing up on the chair behind the counter and grabbing a pencil. You have your books, 4,000 good books, hand-picked, then your fixtures, the bookcases, display racks, etc. Then there's the goodwill, the name, the location. I'd probably sell the whole thing for $25,000. $25,000? I could barely pay my rent, much less $25,000. I already worked double shifts on the psychiatric unit 2 or 3 times a week. The car I drove, a 1969 Volvo I'd bought for $200, didn't have working windshield wipers. On cold nights I had to bring the battery into the house so the car would start in the morning. Frank saw the shock the figure generated. Of course, he continued, I have the heart condition. Plus, I'd have to move all the books that don't sell. So I'd probably take 10,000. I turned away. I didn't have 10,000 either, but Frank continued to negotiate with himself. Then there's the lease on the store, he said, which runs another 3 months. I'll be on the hook for that. So I'm thinking I'd hate to do it, but I'd take 2,000 for the whole thing. He paused. No reaction from me. On a contract for deed at $100 a month. I perked up. And nothing down, he added. And that's how I became the owner of a used bookstore in East St. Paul. It was Mary Pat who told me about the bookstore in the first place. But when I got home and told her I'd bought the business, she was surprised. And not in the honey I brought you flowers way. Even after I assured her the store was a gold mine filled with valuable books, she was skeptical. There were bills to pay, mouths to feed. Still, this was a woman who lived in a rented duplex with 2 kids and a husband who drove a $200 Volvo, so she probably figured her prospects in life couldn't get much worse. Frank and I worked out the details of my taking over the shop the next morning. $180 per month rent, $40 per month for utilities. He showed me around the cramped space, the tiny bathroom, the metal door that led into the alley, the small back room with more broken boxes of books. The shag carpet was so old and matted it crunched when you walked on it. It occurred to me, belatedly some might say, to ask Frank where he got the books in the store. And he said he hauled off whatever didn't sell from church sales, book sales, and estate sales around the Twin Cities. You never have to worry about running out of books, he said. And they're free. The books I now owned, in other words, had been rescued on their way to a dumpster. Frank took me down to a drugstore on the corner and introduced me to the landlord, Roy, and his wife, Greta. Roy was a thin, wiry man in his 50s, a former handyman and construction worker who had bought the building with money he inherited from his father. Greta was well-dressed, short and stocky, With a Germanic accent and jet-black hair, she managed the drugstore, and as a sideline, sold gift items imported from Germany and Poland. The winter winds howled down Arcade Street. "There don't seem to be many people around," I said to Frank. "Winter is slow," he admitted, "but the true bookseller is not bound by the whims of the walk-in customer. You can still sell books through the mail." With that, he pulled out a thick copy of the Antiquarian Bookman's Weekly and looked at it with a special reverence. The A.B. Bookman's Weekly was at the time the leading trade publication in the country for used and rare booksellers. It began in the 1930s as a column in Publishers Weekly called Antiquarian Bookseller, and in 1948 became a separate publication because of the brisk trade in out-of-print and second-hand books. For more than 4 decades, it was essential reading for second-hand booksellers, librarians, and book collectors. Besides news and notices, it published page after page of books for sale and books wanted. It was mailed every week to subscribers. There were over 10,000 in 1982, and was often the size of a small-town phone book. If you wanted to find an obscure title on the properties of cement, say, or a first edition of The Grapes of Wrath, and couldn't find it yourself, you paid a bookseller to advertise for it in the A.B. Bookman's Weekly. If you were lucky, another bookseller would see the ad and send a quote, which was a description of the book and the price printed on a postcard. Weeks or months or years later, the book might turn up and could cost you 4, 5, even 10 times the quoted price. Objective prices were hard to find or non-existent, so the going rate for a book was whatever the bookseller said it was. If you didn't like it, too bad. Frank described the painstaking process of going through the A.B. Bookman every week and finding books he could quote to other booksellers. He showed me a stack of postcards he had ready to mail, with descriptions like Collodi Carlo, The Adventures of Pinocchio, Whitman Publishing, 1932. No dust jacket, covers worn, hinges broken, pages yellowed, $2. Postage, $1.25. The ad for The Adventures of Pinocchio did not specify a date or publisher, so the bookseller looking for it was going to get quotes for hundreds of copies, most of them better than Frank's. I glanced through the other postcards and noticed the going rate for most of his books was $2. Frank also suggested that I could put in a popcorn maker and sell 10-cent bags of popcorn to elementary students on their way home from school. If I sold 1,800 bags a month, or 60 bags a day, including Sundays, I could just about cover my rent. Then he produced the contract for deed, collected his first $100, and handed me the keys. "Good luck," he said, and walked out the door. When the consequences of what I had done became clear, I thought that if selling a second-hand bookstore to someone who didn't know the first thing about used books was a felony, and it should be, Frank would have gone to prison. The store on Arcade Street was a dismal hole, so much so that during the 8 years I was there, every other event in my life, from the kids learning to ride a bike to tomatoes ripening on the vine, was thoroughly documented with photos. But when I looked for a picture of the store to include here, I couldn't find even one, so I went to East St. Paul and took a picture of what it looks like today. It was empty, but ironically, in its last incarnation had been a cell phone and computer repair service store. Mary Pat's father, a successful businessman, was horrified when he saw the place. It convinced him finally that his only daughter had married an idiot, a conclusion that Mary Pat's 6 brothers, who were all on solid career paths, had reached long before. Only my childhood friend Mark Ziegler, who had endorsed, it must be said, many other bad decisions, was supportive. Otherwise, the skepticism from my friends and family was universal. During my first week, I tried to make sense of what I had gotten into. The overflowing fiction section was packed with old novels. A Cigarette Maker's Romance by F. Marion Crawford, The Magnificent Ambersons by Booth Tarkington, The Last Days of Pompeii by Edward Bulwer Lytton. There were shelves of Reader's Digest condensed books, piles of paperbacks priced at $1.25 each, and book club editions of popular novels by James Michener, Ken Follett, and Judith Krantz. Now that I knew where Frank got the books, I could see why they had been rejected by every book freak in town. The store was not a gold mine, but a strip-mined pit. Since I didn't know anything about the book business, I thought I should get some advice, some tips on how to move forward, maybe even make a connection with the wider Twin Cities book world. So I called Larry Dingman, a prominent Minneapolis dealer who specialized in modern first editions, and asked him to come over. When he got to the store, Larry methodically went through the shelves. After about 10 minutes, he turned to me and said, "This is the worst, most picked-over stock of books I've ever seen." And no wonder, I thought, since they were the leftovers Frank had rescued from every down-market book sale in town. Larry did give me some advice. 1, I should get rid of all the books I had. 2, I should get better books. He did not elaborate on what kinds of books those might be. And 3, don't hire anyone to work for you. It'd be a waste of money. And like Frank before him, Larry walked out the door. I had 3 customers and sold $36 worth of books that first week. Never mind that I worked the night shift at the hospital from midnight until 8 in the morning, went home, ate breakfast, and was back at the store from 10 until 5. I learned that Frank's "winter is slow" comment really meant that you could have murdered someone on the corner of Arcade in Maryland and no one would have noticed. Not certainly the geriatric customers going into Roy and Greta's drugstore on the corner. Every so often, one of the more muddled would wander off and walk by my store, but none of them ever came in, which I would have appreciated, if only to have someone to talk to. I'd go through my bookstore hellhole every day and sort through the paperbacks, book club editions, ex-library books, and other rubbish Frank had sold me. As I looked over this empire of bad books, one that was of some consolation was a beat-up copy of Books and Bitters by A.S.W. Rosenbach, a bookseller from Philadelphia who made a fortune selling rare books to the libraries created in the 1920s and 1930s by wealthy robber barons and industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. If nothing else, Rosenbach's story showed me that people could actually make a living selling used books. Rosenbach describes how, as a young boy, he hung around his uncle Moses Pollock's bookstore in Philadelphia, a store founded in 1780, just before the end of the American Revolution. Henry Knox, George Washington's Secretary of War, sold both new and second-hand books. He learned what little he knew about military strategy and tactics at the start of the Revolutionary War from books. The nation's repository for gold bullion, Fort Knox, is named after him. When Pollock bought it in 1831, he became the first bookseller in the United States to specialize in rare Americana. He acquired, among other things, books from George Washington's Mount Vernon Library and a batch of letters from English and American statesmen addressed to John Hancock, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. As Rosenbach remembered in Books and Bitters, first as a publishing house and bookstore combined, Uncle Moses's shop became a meeting place for publishers and writers. Here it was that the ill-fed Edgar Allan Poe came in 1835 to talk modestly of his hopes and dreams. Such men as James Fenimore Cooper, William Cullen Bryant, Noah Webster, and Herman Melville might be seen going up or coming down the narrow staircase leading to the second floor. At that time, and indeed throughout history, second-hand bookstores have been gathering places for writers, politicians, poets, and revolutionaries. James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald hung out at Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company in Paris. City Lights in San Francisco was a center for counterculture politics in the 50s and 60s. And in the 1960s, Melvin McCosh's bookstore in Minneapolis had Bob Dylan and other local radicals as customers and conversationalists. Rosenbach recalled a conversation his uncle had with a customer about Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, Edgar was a genius, in spite of being a gambler and a drunkard. In spite of it, I tell you. The other, a thin man of lesser years, his long, inquiring face meditative in the twilight, said, "You were right," he agreed. "But what difference did it make? Would the Raven have been any greater without his gambling and drinking? I doubt it." A.S.W. earned a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania in 1901 with the dissertation titled The Influence of Spanish Literature and the Elizabethan and Stuart Drama. Financial troubles and his parents' ill health forced him to leave school and formed the Rosenbach Book Company in 1903 with his older brother Philip. I felt a renegade. I deserted the halls of learning for the bookshop. I'd given up my fellowship to enter a business that would, perhaps, put money in my purse. I did not, when at college, appreciate what a high adventure the business was to prove, the excitement and anxiety of the chase, and that I had a better chance, a far greater opportunity to unearth unpublished documents and uncover original source material than ever I could have as an instructor in English in some university. Rosenbach went on to buy and sell some of the most significant original manuscripts in the English-speaking world, including part of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures Underground, and James Joyce's handwritten Ulysses. He loved books, and reveled in the attention he got when these purchases made headlines. He almost single-handedly put together the rare book collections of the Widener, J.P. Morgan, Folger, Huntington, Houghton, and Rosenwald libraries. According to biographer Richard Ellman, Joyce was incensed when he heard Rosenbach bought the Ulysses manuscript in 1924 in Paris at auction for the bargain basement price of $1,975 and memorialized his discontent in a poem. Rosy Brook, he bought a book, though he didn't know how to spell it. Such is the lure of literature to the lad who can buy and sell it. Books weren't Rosenbach's only passion. For him, drinking was a daily occurrence, notes Travis McDade in Thieves of Book Row. He was riding the crest of his wave, one of his biographers noted, and the wave had a high alcoholic content. He was rich, respected, and had the impulse control of an adolescent. My daydreams of becoming a big-time bookseller ended when another worker walked by on the way to pick up some kielbasa without so much as a sideways glance. I didn't know it then, but my purchase of the store on Arcade Street had put me on the lowest rung of the lowest ladder in the book business. I had 4,000 bad books in a bad location and not a dime to my name. 2. Book Scouts and Dead Booksellers. Let him who is in search of knowledge fish for it where it lurks. Michel de Montaigne. I did what I could to attract customers. I made displays of bestsellers from the 1970s. I put the 2 newer children's books, God knows where Frank got those, in the window. I put dollar books in boxes outside the store to attract the cost-conscious book lover, but stopped that after 1, a dog peed in one of the boxes, and 2, some elementary kids took another box and dumped it in front of the liquor store. The liquor store owner, who sold, remember, quarts of Ripple wine for under $1, complained to Roy that the boxes in front of my store made the neighborhood look bad. On the days that Mary Pat worked, she taught community education classes. She took our daughter, Megan, with her and brought our baby son Ben down to the store, where he'd sleep in a playpen in the back room. "Don't let him crawl around in here," she'd tell me. "He'll get all dirty and probably catch some disease."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?